Okay, we're coming to you here in August of 2024 in the low country of South Carolina, talking about what's happening in Bluffton, Beaufort, Hilton Head, real estate transactions through July statistics. We're also going to talk to you about what's happening in the national real estate industry, so stay tuned. Okay, Chris, so here we are. We're in the middle of August. It feels like we're in the middle of summer, but for back to school here in Beaufort County, it's already happened. Kids are back in school. So we're starting to sense that summer from a vacation perspective is winding down a little bit. And now we've already come through July. So we got July stats. So let's just go through the stats really quickly. Kind of take a look at what's been happening in the market. Number of new listings that have hit the market up about 10% from where we were this time last year. Pending sales are just about flat statistically, which is amazing. We are seeing average sales price, a median sales price, both continue to be up around that 7% range. Average days on market has come up a little bit, about a third, but now you're only talking about 56 days on market. And when you're looking at buyers and sellers that are negotiating, come together on terms, that average sales price to list price ratio is still hanging out right about 98%. So pretty good market stats for what we're looking at. Closed transactions are up a hair, about 6% or so from where we were this time last year. So that's kind of what's been happening on the micro side. Let's talk about the macro side. A lot of talk going on out there, both in these walls at Collins Group and locally in our industry, but also nationally in our industry. So let's talk to folks about what's happening with National Association of Realtors and these couple of rules that have changed, and we'll kind of kick around what the implications are.
Right. Well, I tell you what, not really a whole lot has changed based on how we kind of normally conduct business just within Collins Group and in South Carolina for that matter. But some of the things that buyers and sellers will notice, one will be that a written agreement's now required for anybody to go see a listed property for sale. And we've always had some sort of written agreement, like a buyer representation agreement or something like that if you want to hire an agent and go see a property. But we've the National Association of Realtors kind of taken it one step further. And a written agreement is going to be important if you even want to get into an agency relationship, but you just want to go tour a property.
Right. So if you go see a property in person, which people love doing, we love doing, but also virtually a lot of our buyer client and customer base is looking at property absentee. In both of those situations, if you're jumping on a Zoom or a FaceTime, which is sort of not in-person live, but technically live, ahead of that, some level of written agreement has got to be established. And what's that written agreement is sort of doing? Why does a buyer need to have that put in place?
A buyer needs to understand if they're represented. They need to understand how they're going to pay their agent. All of these things need to be talked about up front, agreed to, and before you even start the search process. And like you said, even if a buyer wants to actively engage an agent and have their agent do a FaceTime video, they're going to have some written agreement, some understanding of how that agent's going to get compensated on that transaction.
What's really cool about that too, and we love, at Collins Group, it sounds crazy, but we like moments of change. We like moments of challenge. It gives us an opportunity to shine, honestly. And it's sort of a rally call internally for us, as we've been doing over the last couple of weeks, to come together, figure out our systems, figure out our paperwork, figure out our options and the best ways to represent buyers and sellers. So when we talk about, a buyer being confronted with having to have technically a written agreement, we've got a lot of different options for them to consider. Some where they could be a customer, some where they could be a client, some where we're having discussions about compensation, some where the compensation is still going to continue to flow from the listing agency or the seller. So it's been fun to kind of go through that process of figuring out what are the options that we have available. And we're eager to sort of roll up our sleeves and have those conversations. It's just with the National Association of Realtors, this rule, it's pushing that conversation a little bit further up the line. And I think that's where maybe a little pain point might come for buyers to be surprised at that. So what we suggest is buyers just need to be prepared. We're ready to have a strategy discussion with you. We're ready to have a virtual discussion with you. We're ready to have an in-office meeting with you. Those meetings are gold. We're just having to have those a little bit further up the road.
Right. And I think other states around the country are going to have more of a shock and awe on this than South Carolina. South Carolina's been practicing some degree of this for a very long time. In Collins Group, we've been doing this
15 years across the board,
right.
we're already having those conversations. So it doesn't feel new. Let's talk about what's new technically on the seller side. So what's the second item, the rule that's changing?
Well, in the past, compensation has been publicized or presented to other agents in the MLS. So whatever a seller is deciding that they want to compensate a buyer professional, buyer agent in a transaction, that has been listed on the MLS and sent out. And there's some concerns and problems with that, because that's something that needs to be a little bit held back. So basically, moving forward, starting in a couple of days, that's not going to be a part of the MLS anymore. There's not going to be a compensation alert or a compensation.
There's no field, there's no disclosure, there's no communication of it. In fact, NAR has basically said, you can't put that in there at all. Like, don't touch this.
No, it can be anything associated with the MLS and compensation can't go together. But those conversations still will happen. They have to happen between brokers, and they have to happen with written documentation, which again, that written documentation, everybody knows what's going on.
Right. So the thing that I like about it, we're studying this pretty heavily. There's a couple things about just because you can't communicate or advertise the compensation that might come from a seller who wants to incentivize a buyer agent, doesn't mean that they can't do that. And it doesn't mean that they shouldn't do that. It just means that it can't reside in the MLS. So I like that it's creating a more dynamic, transparent, roll up your sleeve conversation about compensation strategy with sellers. Like, well, here's the moving parts. What do you want to do? How do you want to handle that? Because there's a whole other co-side of that that has to do with concessions, and we'll get into more video on that later on. The other part I really like about it is that because the compensation field isn't in the MLS, a buyer agent who's going to be asking, because they need to let their buyer know, is there compensation for that buyer agent on this property or not? Hugely important in that conversation. They got to pick up the phone and call the listing agent. And so now you've got more engagement, direct engagement between the agents, which I think previously didn't happen because that data was already resident on the MLS.
I think that's huge. And I think it's really important too that agents and their clients have these conversations up front, because compensation's always been negotiable. But a lot of folks don't understand that. And I think having everything discussed and talked about and transparent up front, and everybody knows the playing field, is going to be so helpful.
100%. You know, I think about how we have always aimed to be so communicative, so transparent, so detailed in our representation and discussion with both buyers and sellers. And so many times we run across folks that just don't understand how realtors get paid or what that process looks like, etc. I think that's been the case for a long time. I love the transparency component. I love that all of that is now much more out and obvious in the open and open for discussion in terms of strategy on both sides of the transaction.
So agree.
So a lot happening in the country, a lot happening locally, a lot of good things happening in our marketplace. So stay tuned. We'll be coming back at you again soon.